because you're never quite sure what they're saying is true. So much of it is just about as phony as a $4 bill. So, you listen to it with a grain of salt, and you think, okay, maybe it's real, and maybe it's not. Maybe they don't know what they're talking about. And it doesn't help that you get things like CBS a couple years ago, or not even a couple years ago, a couple months ago, televised what was supposed to be the attack on American military forces following the assassination of one of their generals, an Iranian general, who was, one of the leaders of terrorism, who was shot and killed by the American military. And this was supposedly their retaliation. They're showing all these rockets and bombs and things blowing up, and they're reporting that this is real, that this is what's going on right now, and that all of our soldiers are going to die, and da-da-da-da-da. Well, it turns out that what they were showing was a Army test of military rockets. They were using, it was a testing ground video. And if you looked closely at the video, you could see American pickup trucks off to the side and military jeeps and all this other stuff. So, the reality is that it was phony. It was phonier than a $4 bill. And so the news has become more and more unreliable. The reality is the news has never really been that reliable. Let's face it, the news is in it to make money. I mean, that's the bottom line. They're there to make waves, to make it mean, to make it nasty, because they want to sell papers, or they want to sell television time, or they want to sell advertising. They don't do all that from the goodness of their heart. And yeah, there may be some decent journalists out there, but the reality is that they make it worse. I read somewhere the other day that if you wanted to stop all the worry and concern about the COVID virus, you just needed to turn off the news media. I don't know. And I'm not blaming the news for the problems we have. I'm just saying that they escalate it. And so tonight we're going to talk about when trouble comes. We're starting a new series in the book of Ruth, and Ruth is a very odd book, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But when hard times comes, we have really two choices. We can say, okay, I'm going to complain about it. I'm going to be a victim, or I'm going to be a student. A victim says, well, why did this happen to me? Or why they complain about being treated unfriendly, or why they're not being treated as they deserve. And the reality is that a student will say, well, what can I learn from this? And thank God that I'm getting better than what I deserve. And a victim says, I want to get even with those who hurt me. And a student says, let's kind of serve others in the midst of his difficulty. The reality is that a perceptive reader can probably think of 100 other comparisons, but the point is very clear. We rarely control what happens to us. Raise your hand if you think you're in control. And I'm going to tell you right now, you're wrong. Because every last one of us is not in control. There is nobody in this room who's truly in control. I learned that the hard way. It took me a lot of time for me to finally dawn on me. When you think you've got it all fixed and all figured out, God will throw a monkey wrench in there to remind you, hey, look, the one who's really in control is not you. It's Him. God is the only one in control. And Michael Boyd is not in control. He's just trying to follow as best he can. The reality is my God is in control. So we can't control what happens to us. You're never going to change any of that. The reality is you can't change any of that. I think right now, I'm looking at, I'm praying for the people in Louisiana, and I'm praying for the hurricane, but the truth is, they're not in control of that. They didn't say, okay, let's let the hurricane go here, and we're going to direct it, and we've got a little remote control somewhere that's directing it. That is strictly done by rules of the weather that God created in this planet, that God embedded in this planet the way it works. The reality is that I'm not sure that God is involved in every moment of every second, but He put rules in place, He put things, and it works unless He intervenes the way He designed it. Now, admittedly, this world is a world that is cursed by sin, and so a lot of what He designed into it have been circumvented by our sin. But the reality is that we're not in control of what happens to us. You're not in control of what happens to you. You can't control what your boss does. You can't even control what happens in the weather outside, much less when it goes dark and when it becomes light. Now, how many of you think that you can control whether it rains tomorrow or not? Or whether a traffic light turns on you or not? You can't. Okay? The reality is that we're not in control. But when we're not in control, We can control how we respond. You know, the pastor I grew up under used to say that Christians were like toothpaste tubes. When they get squeezed, what's on the inside comes out. If it's filled with the love of God, then when you get squeezed, what's going to come out is the love of God. But when you're filled with bitterness and anger and hatred and envy and is out when you get squeezed? Bitterness and anger and hatred. You know, all the things you fill yourself up with is what comes out. I ran across this article the other day, and I thought I want to share it with you. The head of a company survived 9/11 because his son started kindergarten that morning. Another man was alive because it was his turn to bring the donuts. One woman was late because her alarm clock didn't go off and she was running late to get to work. Another was stuck on the New Jersey Turnpike because of an accident and her life was spared. One missed his bus, one spilled food on their clothes and had to go back in and change before they left. One's car wouldn't start. One couldn't get a taxi. One went to answer the house phone, went back in to answer the phone. The man who put on a new pair of shoes that morning developed a blister before he got to the tower, so he stopped at a drugstore to get Band-Aids for his feet. When you're stuck in traffic, when you oversleep, when you miss your ride, all the little things that annoy you, all the hardships, all the problems, the reality is maybe you're exactly where you're meant to be at that very moment. And while I pray for all the folks who were affected by those who died in 9/11, the reality is that God is in control. And we don't control any of that. No, people decided, well, I'm going to be late for work because I know this. They didn't know what was going to happen. We cannot control, but we can control how we respond. You know, there's a book in the Bible called Ruth. It's about a woman named Naomi. And if you find her story in the Old Testament in the book of Ruth, you're going to find a very different book. Okay? It's an account of anxiety and love and fear and commitment, and that inflames the imagination and soothes the soul. It begins with despair and ends with delight. Okay? It's an account of anxiety. I mean, this little tiny book that we're going to look at for the next couple of weeks, it's only got 4 chapters. It's 85 total verses. And it covers everything in human emotion you can possibly imagine, starting with heartache, moving to intrigue and romance, and then happiness. And along the way, the primary focus, the primary theme of this whole book is that God is at work behind the scenes. Which means the real star of the book is God himself. It's not Naomi, it's not Ruth, it's God at work. It is the Lord who works in, through, and sometimes in spite of the decisions we make. So the opening verse sets the scene for us. During the time of the judges, there was a famine in the land, and a man left Bethlehem in Judah with his wife and 2 sons to stay in the territory of Moab for a while. And the man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. And they were Ephrathites, from Bethlehem in Judah. They entered the fields of Moab and settled there. Naomi's husband Elimelech died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Her sons took Moabite women as their wives. One was named Oprah, and the other was named Ruth. And after they lived in Moab for about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion died, and Naomi was left without her 2 children and without her husband. You know, the reality is, we look at this, and man, this is just so much going on in 5 verses. Here we have Ruth, right? Now, here's the thing that you need to keep in mind in all of this. There's some themes that I think we need some things we can learn from this. First off, hard times can happen to anyone at any time. You know, the book of Ruth opens with a note that anchors the story in a particular time and place. During the time of the judges. So we know it's after Joshua and before King Saul. Okay, it's during one of the times of one of the judges. Okay, there was a famine in the land. This means the story, you know, we know where the story took place, basically. When we read the book of Judges, we may be tempted to think it was a godless time, but that would be entirely not true. We should think of it as a time when men did what was right in their own eyes. Judges 21:25. As long as the judges ruled, the people served the Lord. It kind of went this way. God would raise up a judge to rule the land. And that judge would liberate the people, restore the nation, and they would go on in peace and prosperity, and they would serve God. And then the judge would die. And no other judge would rise up, and so they would go to their own way. They would do what they thought right in their own mind. And so they'd wander off, and they'd start worshiping Baal, and they'd start doing child sacrifice and animal sacrifice and all the perversions and everything else that was going on around them. And then God would send somebody in to punish them for their sin, and they would be carried off into captivity, or they would be attacked. You know, we know the story of Gideon. Gideon was the judge he raised up because they were coming in and taking all the food. They were raising crops, and they were doing well successfully, but the truth is that every time they got a harvest, the Philistines would come in and attack and take everything. And so God raised up Gideon to defeat the Philistine army with 300 men, which is an amazing story in itself, and we're not going to cover that tonight. But what I want you to see is that's what's going on here. This is one of those times when there's not a judge in Israel, and so God really didn't want to give them a king. He never planned to give them a king. He planned to have it direct rule of the kingdom himself. And let's face it, folks, if they would get the concept of this and they would obey God, let me tell you something, that's the best run country in the world, is a country run by God himself. I mean, there's nothing better. The problem is that we're sinners and we don't follow and we don't obey, and eventually we go off and do our own thing and we get in trouble, and then God has to do something to discipline us. I look around in my own country and I think that's what's going on right now. I mean, I realize that some of the modern histories want to tell you that the founding fathers were all monsters and blah, 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 blah. Well, I'm on news for you. Okay, I've read the founding fathers' original writings, the things that they actually wrote, the histories they wrote, the dialogues, the discussions they had. Do you know there are 2 books that are quoted by the founding fathers when they were discussing creating the Constitution? You know what 2 books they quoted most? Leviticus and Numbers. Read those 2. They're really exciting literature, right? But they quoted Leviticus. They were trying to make our country foundation on the same principles that God founded Israel with. I mean, whether or not they were all Christians, we know that Jefferson was a deist. He wasn't. He wasn't a believer, but we know that Adams and Washington and all those other guys, they all had a conversion experience. Washington was saved as part of that whole business that happened after the revival. I mean, you got to remember, in the late 1600s, there was a revival that took place. It swept through, came out of New England and swept all through. In fact, it converted the area we call Kentucky. Kentucky used to be like they had river pirates, and it was a loose and wild place. And you took your own life in your own hands to travel through there without an armed guard, because there were burglars and highwaymen and river pirates everywhere. And that revival that broke out of Jonathan Edwards Church and swept through our colonies is what ended up leading to the salvation of George Washington and John Adams and all those founding fathers. John and Samuel Adams and all those guys. They all got saved out of that revival that came out of Jonathan Edwards Church, and that's what ended up founding our country. That's where that came from. That's what happened. That's what led to the United States. But that's what our foundations are. Unfortunately, somewhere in the 60s, we just kind of abandoned our foundations. We started pushing God out of our public life and out of our schools, and we're no longer teaching about God. And the reality is, what we ended up with is that I think that we are reaping what we have sown as a nation over the last 40 years. Last 50 years, actually. I think that that's what happened on 9/11. You know, we started out reading a story about those guys in 9/11 who were spared. Well, I believe the reason that God allowed that to happen in this country, because it's the first attack that's ever taken place on our soil by a foreign country. You know that? When Japan took Hawaii, that wasn't a state yet. It was still a territory. It wasn't a state. That is the first time. 9/11 is the first time anybody ever attacked the United States soil belonging to the United States. Now, there's been a couple times we got attacked when they were territories and colonies. The War of 1812 was fought mostly in our colonies. mostly in our territories, most of it in the West. When we really didn't own it yet, we were still negotiating for it. We had bought it from France, and we really, and England wanted to take it back. So the reality is all that's going on. So since 1812, and we haven't even had a war on our continent since 1812. So that's what, 100 years? Almost 200 years? 1812 to 1911 and 2011. That's pretty bad. That's pretty wonderful, huh? 1812, 1912, 2011, right? That's 199 years since there was an attack on our continent. And I believe that 9/11, 2001 is because of what happened, because of the way we walked away from God, and it is God trying to get our attention. And I believe that that's what we're dealing with when we talk about Ruth. Okay? Now, look at what it says in Deuteronomy 20:24. The Lord will change the rain of your land to powder and dust. From the heaven it shall come down on you until you are destroyed. Now, you need to understand what that's talking about. There's a whole passage from Deuteronomy 28, starting in verse 13, and it talks about all this going, and they're saying, God's given them the law, and they're saying, may it be on our heads if we do not obey this. We want to. They're all excited. They're making all these promises, and God says, if you do not obey me, and He lists all these things starting in verse 10. This is what's going to happen if you do not obey the voice of the Lord your God. You don't observe carefully all the commandments and His statutes when I command you today. That all these curses are coming upon you. And one of the curses, He says, I'm going to turn your rain into powder, and I'm going to run dust and powder on your land, and heaven shall come down on you until you are destroyed. Basically, I'm going to bring famine to your land, and you're going to be forced to turn back to me. Okay? It was a reoccurring cycle of obedience, disobedience, judgment, suffering, desperation, and returning to the Lord. That was that whole cycle throughout the book of Judges. And they're in that time when they've been disobedient, and God is disciplining them, and they haven't yet returned to the Lord. And that's when all this takes place. You see, guys, you need to keep something very much in mind. God can ring your doorbell anytime, day or night. He can call you. He can dictate you. He can find you. Okay? We think we don't have to worry about it because God will just ignore me. No, He doesn't. He knows exactly what you're doing every moment of every day. You don't have to worry about God speaking to you. God has your number on speed dial. And He can ring your phone any time of the day or night. And when He calls, you won't be able to put Him on call waiting, or you won't be able to transfer Him to the answering machine. God knows how to get through to you at any time, in any way. He knows how to get your attention. And I believe that's what's going on in our country today. We are reaping the results of what happened over the last 50 years. Because hard times can happen at any time, and I believe God is using those hard times to say, America, wake up. If you do not turn to me, if you do not return to me, if you do not fall on your face and repent, then I will take America out of the picture. See, guys, you need to remember two things. Number one, we're not the promised land. The United States is not the promised land. We're not God's chosen people. Israel was. And God disciplined Israel. Every time they failed, every time He showed them mercy, and finally He would finally reach a point where He would discipline them. He'd carry them off into captivity, or He would bring plunder to their land, or He would devastate them with a plague. Got news for you, folks. America is not God's chosen land, and because it's not God's chosen land, God is not going to be as patient with the United States as it is with Israel, that He was with Israel. You know what redeems this country right now? Is His chosen people, the church. We're it. We're the only thing that's given God, and the reason God has given mercy to this nation now. And I'm watching what's going on in our world today, and I'm watching what's going on in California. You know, they're trying to shut down John MacArthur's church. You know why? Because he continues to have services. He reached the end of the point where he can't. You know, he's decided that I'm not going to do online services anymore because it's not really. I've got too many people playing the spectator game and not really being engaged and not really participating, and that's not what church is supposed to be. It's not a spectator sport. Everybody's supposed to be involved in ministry, and so he's just decided he's going to have services. He's feeling like, and the state of California they closed his parking lots. They're trying to repossess his land. One is shutting down. They want to take away his certificate of occupancy. They're suing him. They're taking him to court. They're fining him thousands of dollars every day to try to close him down because they don't want his church to meet. And I believe we live in a nation where the church is slowly being strangled to death by our governments. And so as it does so, the reason God has been merciful to this country is going to go away more and more every day. I realize that as Christians we should expect hardship and struggle and persecution. I mean, they persecuted our Lord. Why wouldn't they persecute us? But as they do so, it creates an effect in our nation where it says, you know what? I spared you because the church had freedom, had ability to worship. But if you're taking all that away, then I will strip this nation of everything it holds dear to bring it to its knees, to force it into prayer, to force it into repentance. Okay? See, hard times happen to everybody, and I think that's what's going on in our country today. Hard time also makes us face some hard choices. Now, if you're Amalek, what do you do when famine impacts your family? The land around Bethlehem is some of the most fertile land in the Promised Land. And a man who worked hard could harvest enough every year to feed his family and many, many others. So what do you do when famine hits? For Amalek, he would make a very simple choice. He took his family and moved to Moab because it was a land of good soil and adequate rainfall. If famine had not hit that region, perhaps he could stay on for a few months or even a year or two. The fact that he was an Ephrathite may throw some more light on the matter. I can't even say it. Ephrathah, is the original name of Bethlehem. It implies that he came from a distinguished background, from a family with a long history in the region. It would be like saying, here's a man from Beverly Hills in Los Angeles. It didn't guarantee he had money, but he's from Beverly Hills, right? So it suggests something about his background. Amalek lost his life while seeking a livelihood and found a grave where he had sought a home. It appears in the text that things worked out for a while, right? And evidently they settled in the fields of Moab and they found plenty to eat. The famine of Bethlehem was probably a distant memory at that time. But soon, Amalek dies. We aren't told why or how, only that he died in Moab, leaving Naomi without a husband and the two boys without a father. Now, let's build a picture here because I want you to understand the culture we're talking about. In that day and time, it's very different the way we live today. But in that culture, women did not own land, they could not testify in court, they could not work, right? You know what happened when their husband died? Their brother of the father, the brother of the husband would adopt the family and he would care for that family for the rest of her life. That was his job, that was his responsibility as the next brother. Now here's the problem with that, of course, there's not a brother-in-law because where are they? They're not in Jerusalem. They're not in Bethlehem. So they've left the Promised Land. They're in Moab. They're in the midst of all these pagan Moabites. And here they are, and her husband dies. Right? Now, so what happens? She's got two sons. And two sons, what do? They've no longer got their father directing them anymore. Right? They're at the point where, at that point, they're probably caring for their mom. And they get married. Well, there's no Jews around to marry. There's nobody from the homeland. It's not like they can go back to Bethlehem and find some nice Jewish girls and marry them. So he marries the local people. He marries Moabites. They both do. And they go by 10 years, and boom, they die. Now, remember what I said about if the next in kin dies? What happens when there's not a brother and the sons are old enough to care for their mom? If their mom is taken care of by the boys for the rest of their lives. So you know what happens? You know what's going to happen here. Naomi, her two sons die. She's got two daughter-in-laws. They've been her daughter-in-laws for several years now. We don't really know how long they were married before the boys died. Obviously, not really long time because they both are childless. I'm not saying anything about them having sons, so we know that whoever they were, the Moabite women didn't have any kids. Actually, Chilion and the other son didn't have any children. I don't know about Oprah Oprah and Ruth. And we know from later on in the book that they do have kids, so obviously they could. But for whatever reason, whatever long they were married, they didn't have any kid. And so they both died. Now we've got a widowed woman and 2 widowed daughter-in-laws, and they're all alone. They can't own land. They can't work. The only way they can make a living is to beg. That's the predicament they're in. It's not like they can turn to the Jewish leadership in their community, because there's not. And so they're desperate. Elimelech intended to immigrate to Moab for a while, meaning he never intended to leave Judah forever. It was a temporary move into a foreign territory made under great duress. But God was very clear that the Israelites were never to have anything to do with Moab. Listen to what Deuteronomy 23:3 says. No Amorite or Moabite may enter the Lord's assembly. None of their descendants, even to the 10th generation, may enter the Lord's assembly. Never pursue their welfare or prosperity as long as you live. You know what that says? You're not supposed to have anything to do with the Moabites. Now, the reason they're not supposed to have anything to do with them, they're an ancient foe of Israel. Moab originated from the Lot's incestuous relationship with his daughters. He was leaving the land of blessing to live among the pagans on the east side of the Dead Sea, and he and his family would be exposed to Moabite religion and its degrading idol worship and gross sexual perversions. I think Amalek understood the risk, but considered the move temporary expedient for the sake of his family. Now, guys, I got news for you. You can choose to disobey, but if you do, you need to be prepared for the consequences. Okay? The problem in Israel was not the lack of bread. The problem was the lack of obedience to Jehovah. This was not the first famine in the land flowing with milk and honey, and it definitely wasn't going to be the last. But good motives can't cancel the impact of bad decisions, folks. Recently, I read a report by a friend of mine who works with a group of students at a Christian school, and here's what he told them. He told them that they needed to obey. There were institutional rules that they had to obey about what to rule and all that stuff, and designated curfew time, things like that. And then he asked them if they needed to agree with the rules. And a lot of students, oh yes, we need, that we have to. But that's not really true. What matters is not whether you like the rules or whether you agree with them. The only question is, will you obey them? You can dislike the rules, but as long as you're obedient to what God calls you to do, it doesn't matter whether you like them. And God's not asking you to like them. He's asking you to obedience. You're free to have your own vision, but you're not free to disobey without consequences. Motives matter, but in real life, obedience matters more. There's a principle here. When you disobey God, there are consequences built in. Yes, I can go to God and say, God, I repent, and I really mean it. And God says, I forgive you. And as far as He's concerned, He wipes my sin. He throws my sin as far as the east is from the west, and remembers them no more. He dunks them in the sea of forgetfulness, and they're gone. See, God's forgiven my sin. He's wiped the slate clean. But there are natural consequences when you obey certain rules. Sometimes God will intervene, all right, and He'll take away the consequences. But that's not very often. Most of the time, He's got a system set up and a set of rules, and that's going to happen no matter what. And so when you sin, yes, you may go to God and say, forgive me, Lord, and He will forgive you. But there still may be consequences to your sin. Let's put it to you this way. Tomorrow I decide I can't handle this anymore. I'm sick of this. I'm tired of paying my bills. I'm going to go rob a bank and take all my money and pay off all my debts. Okay? And I do it. I rob the bank. I steal all this money. And I realize afterwards I'm so guilty, and I finally get down on my knees and, God, forgive me. And I go turn the money in, right? I take it back and turn it in. And God says, I forgive you. I mean it. I repented. I restitution. And the police come and they still arrest me. And they take me to jail. There are consequences built into certain actions. The reality is that I committed a crime and I deserve to be punished for it. God has forgiven me of it, and I repented, and it's been made right. But as far as God is, as far as the world goes, as far as the consequences built into the rules, they're there, and I can't make them go away. I can't just say because I forget it, I'm going to make it pretend that I never happened. No, it doesn't work that way. Okay, so the reality is you're free to disobey, but there's always going to be consequences. Yeah, God is rich in grace, and His pockets are deep and full of mercy. But that doesn't change the fact that there are consequences built into our actions. We all feel the urge we need to change. When, God is rich in grace, and we can't run from our problems. The reality is we all think we're going to run from them. That's exactly what Elimelech does. He runs from his problems, and he runs right into more trouble. You can dream of moving to a new house, or getting a new neighborhood, or finding a new job, or getting a new husband, or a new wife, or new kids, or maybe even a new dog. I want to make a fresh start. Things are going to get better. We're going to do this, it's going to get better. It's going to do that, it's going to be better. It's going to do this, it's going to be better. And sometimes that's true. We can make changes. After all, changes are not always bad, but change can be an excuse not to face the problems of life head on. And when you run away from your trouble, you know what usually happens? You end up running right back into it. Every time you try to run from God, you end up running into Him. And when you're having a problem and you're being disobedient, taking it and going somewhere else is not going to save you from going through the consequences. They may delay the consequences, but they're going to be there. See, what we don't seem to get sometimes is the problem when we try to run away from our trouble is when we take the number one reason we have trouble with us. See, I can get all worked up and say, well, I'm having struggle at work, and I'm not happy, and I'm miserable, and everybody's mean to me, and everybody needs worms, and whatever you want to say. And so I'm going to quit my job and go somewhere else. You know what happens? The reason you're unhappy is not your boss, it's not your fellow employees, not any of that. You know what it is? It's you. You're the focus of it, you're the center of it, and so when you have a problem at work, if you run away from it, guess what? It's going to follow right along with you because you're going to be the source of the problem is you. So you cannot run from your problems because your problems will follow you wherever you go. Elimelech thought he could go to Moab, stay until the famine passed, and then run back home. But you know what? At the end of this, Moab's got 3 new graves there. He's got Elimelech, his son Chilion, right? He's got him and his 2 sons. And his wife is there by herself. He made bad decisions. Instead of finding a livelihood, he found a grave. See, guys, you can't run from your problems because your problems follow you. And this is such a downer sermon, Michael. Why are you doing this to us? Well, what I want you to see is where number 3 comes in. Hard times prepare us for a great work of grace. Oswald Chambers once wrote the dance of circumstance, by which he meant the hand of God working through seemingly random events. Who raised up the judges? God did. Who sent the famine? God did. Who gave the safe passage to Moab? God did. Who decreed that 3 men in the family should die there? God did. And as far as we know, God never speaks directly to Elimelech, yet He is the unseen hand moving among events, just like He is for us. We don't think, oh, what am I going to do? I've dug myself into this hole, and I'm such bad, and everything's gone wrong, and my cat doesn't like me, and my dog is mad at me, and the termites are even picking on me. Everybody's mean to me. I'm just going to go eat. Guess what? God is still in control. And He is the unseen hand working in the background. Whatever else you may say about your life, don't ever forget that God oversees the tiniest details. Nothing escapes His notice, and even the most unlikely events are part of His plan for you. Just like we said about 9/11. Those people were spared because of very unlikely annoyances. But that's just it. We have the same thing. Bad things happen to us, and we get all annoyed about them, but it's maybe God working it out. Let me give you, and this one happened to me. I know a perfect example. One afternoon, I'm on my way home from work, right? And I have a blowout, and I end up on the side of the road with a blown tire. It's raining, I'm frustrated, I'm changing the tire in the rain, I'm miserable, and I'm fussing and complaining and ranting and raving about not being, having to do this in the rain, and it's delaying me, and I'm going to be late getting home, and all these other things weren't going to happen. I finally got the tire changed, get the car back on the road, I start down the road, I get about, maybe 1.5 miles, and all the traffic is stopped. Five minutes before my tire blew. Semi lost it in the road. Flipped over Fortunately, there was nobody around him. Skidded to a stop. Nobody was hurt. But you know what? If I hadn't had a flat tire, you know where I would have been when that truck jackknifed? I'd have been right next to it. Figured out the timing and the reports and everything else. I would have been right there. That truck would have come down on top of my little car, and I might not be here to talk about it. See, I got all worked up about it at the time. I didn't realize just how much God had spared me until about a month and a half later, and I was reading the details in the paper. They were talking about the report about how nobody got hurt, and it just seems like all the traffic evaporated right before he lost it. Even the driver of the truck wasn't hurt. Guys, I got news for you. That was my God at work. That was my God orchestrating things and protecting us and protecting me. When Moab's family, when Elimelech's family left Bethlehem, there were 4 of them. 3 men, 1 woman, Elimelech, Naomi, Mahlon, and Chilion. Now Naomi's alone. She's buried all 3 of her husband and both sons in the mountains of Moab. And when she discusses her situation with Ruth and Oprah, she declares that God has turned his hand against her. Because what she's forgetting is that God knows what he's doing, even when we don't have a clue. He's preparing Naomi for a great work of grace. She doesn't know what's coming. She has no clue. As our text ends, Naomi is still in Moab, far from home, coping with the loss of her husband and her sons. She's alone. She has nobody to care for her. She's got no family. She's in a pagan land, separated from God's people, facing the consequences of her husband's unwise decision. She's an older widow in company of 2 younger women. 2 younger widows, not an ideal place to be in any sense. You know, Naomi would probably write the words hopeless across that. She's stuck. No hope of ever having another child, the 2 younger widows by her side, and those 2 younger women are not Jews but Moabites. As far as Naomi is concerned, not only does she have no future, but neither do they if they stay with her. See, our challenge is we read the book and we know the end, if you know the story. We face the same issue when we read Joseph in the book of Genesis. How much did Joseph know about the end of the story when his brothers cast him in the pit in Genesis 37? To kill him? Or he didn't even know they were going to throw him into slavery. They told him they were going to throw him in the pit to kill him. The answer is he didn't know a thing. Nada. Zip. Zero. Ask the same question when he's carried off by the Midianites and then sold as a slave to Potiphar. Now, how did he know about the future when Potiphar's wife falsely accused him of rape, or when Potiphar had him thrown in jail, or when the cupbearer promised to remember him, but instead forgot about him as he languished in an Egyptian prison? The answer is the same thing. He did not know a thing. I mean, we like to repeat, well, what is meant for evil, God meant for good. But no, Joseph didn't know any of this. Joseph's endurance is not explained by all that. Joseph had no advanced knowledge that that as a Hebrew slave, he would eventually become second in command in Egypt. None of that. You see, God has a blueprint for my life. He has a blueprint for your life. The problem is, it's in the second floor of the administration building in heaven, in a locked safe, in a locked room, and God has the only key and the only combination. He's the only one who will ever see it. You're not going to be given advance notice of what tomorrow will bring. You're not even going to know what the next 15 minutes will bring. It's true for all of us. Rich, poor, black, white, yellow, purple, polka dot, peppermint. New Christian, mature believer. We all must take life as it comes to us, one day at a time. So we've got Ruth here. She's a bruised believer and brokenhearted at what she's lost. She still believes in God, even in a foreign land, cut off from her own people. If she's bitter at the Lord, at least she's not turned away from Him. She's got what comes. We can callously say, well, she got what's coming to her, and we only reveal how little we understand about God's heart. He is rich in grace, and His pockets are deep and full of mercy. God has not given up on Naomi, no matter what she may think about Him. He has big plans that are about to unfold. She doesn't know any of this. Little does she know that one day she will hold a baby in her lap who will be the grandfather of King David. Still less could she imagine that her daughter-in-law Ruth, a Moabite woman of all things, would end up on the line that would produce the Messiah. Her sadness will be turned to joy, and she will discover that where sin abounds, grace abounds even more. But all that's yet to come. And when we reach the end of this chapter, verse 5 in Ruth 1, and we leave the story there, we need to know that the thought that we serve a God who can take the worst and turn it into best, because that's the kind of God He is. God says, I'm going to take your worst circumstances. I'm going to take whatever's going on in you. And you may not understand why. You may not get a clue as to why I'm doing all this. But I can take the worst thing that's happening and turn it into the best, because that's the kind of God He is. All we've got to do is give God time to work. He doesn't work in our own time frame. He doesn't work in our own details. He does it in His own time frame and for His own purposes. And we may never realize. We tell the story of Job. We've read the story of Job. And Job went through all that, and God never told him exactly why he went through all he did. In the end, God restored him, but Job didn't know any of that to begin with. He didn't know a thing. The reality is our God knows what He's doing even when we don't have a clue. He's already in control. That's the hardest thing for us to grasp, because we want to think, I want to be the boss, but God's the boss. And the faster you learn that, brothers and sisters in Christ, the simpler your life will become. That your God is in control and you're not the boss. I love those movies where the person says, well, you're not the boss of me. You know what? You're right. You're not the boss of me. Your God is the boss of me. You are. Let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you. As we approach you today, we recognize that we are simply sinners saved by grace. We don't deserve your mercy, yet you chose to be merciful. Lord, we stand in absolute amazement that you are working details out behind the scenes we don't have a clue about. We have no idea what you're doing. But we trust you, and we know that you're in control. And so, in the midst of the insanity, we can say, my God has got it taken care of. I don't have to do a thing but trust Him. It's so hard for us, Lord. Because we think we've got to have the map and all laid out, and we've got to have it all planned. But we don't. Because you, my Lord and my God, are the one in control. And so we can say that I have faith in you, and I can trust in you.